and welcome to part 2 of the Praxis Table Talks analysis of Julius Evola's Revolt Against the Modern World. Our last episode dealt with chapters 1 and 2, which dealt with what Evola called the traditional worldview versus the modern one, and the idea of regality. And so this episode is going to take place after that. Obviously, in the next few chapters, we're going to go through chapter 3 and 5, which details. Let's see. The first one deals with polar symbolism, and the second one with the idea of the state, and then the fifth one with the idea of the rite. And we've kind of grouped these chapters, or these recordings, with chapters that kind of go together or have a similar theme. And that's one thing you'll find throughout this book, is that the different chapters kind of go with each other as the book goes along. There's a certain topic, it has a few chapters about it, and then there's a certain other broad topic, and it has a few chapters about it. And all of these make sense kind of in the end when you wrap up the book and you understand the full point. So yeah, we're going to go through that, but before I move on, I have with me a member of our leadership council. Cody, how are you doing today?
Pretty well, though. It's funny, out of all the times you say that, you get it so backwards this time.
I know, right? That's okay. It's been a long day, right? But yeah, so what were your thoughts on reading these next chapters? Because I've read the book before, so I kind of know what to expect. I'm just kind of re-going over it, retracing my old steps, whereas you're like seeing it for the first time, laying eyes on it. So what were your thoughts?
It's funny because in my readings of it, and then seeing what other content creators and followers of philosophy are posting about online, there seems to be a bit of synchronicity in this mindset of regality and of a central point in which to fixate everything around our temporal existences and spiritual existences. And I'll get the names in a moment for some of those content creators and what they were talking about specifically, but even some friends in my personal life. I've gone on a road trip recently and had some deep conversations with people of all different backgrounds and belief systems that have echoed many of the same things Evola was saying here, and none of them knew of Evola before I brought him up in these conversations. So it was interesting that they had, this, like the fifth chapter is the Mystery of the Rite, and a point of initiation into society. Black Pilled was one of the content creators, if you're familiar with him, that brought up this point, I think a little bit in his 4th of July stream. But sorry to date the episode too, but it happens.
Yeah.
And, a few different other aspects to that there. It seems like the conscious writing of Evola on these subjects, though he is far more learned, seems to be permeating in the consciousness of regular lay people, it seems. And I mean, I wouldn't call the groups we surround ourselves with, or the individuals we surround ourselves with, as lay people or the common man, but definitely individuals that aren't like Evola himself, I guess, to put it. It's just, it seems to be becoming more
they're not of that like intellectual
sense,
caliber
almost. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not to say they're not very bright people, and they are. That's why they're thinking about these things in the first place. But it seems to be almost like synchronatic in a way, where all these different people detaching themselves from modernity are just getting these things fundamentally, and seeing the refined version in Evola's text has such a more impactful aspect to it now that it's being applied in reality in these ashes of society, whereas he was just more seeing down the road in a more hypothetical concept, and now it's just the lived reality that we're in.
Right. And what he talks about is, I guess the thing with Evola is that he is very refined, as you say, and so the stuff that he writes down, it's very rigid and clear what it is he supports and what it is he's against, and not only that, but it also is very clear what it is he's talking about and what he doesn't mean to connote with various other terms that he uses. So, we were just talking about off call, like using various terms to substitute for other terms, and he's very good at, outlining a certain idea and then referring to that idea as whatever principle it was. So, like, for example, the solar principle or the Uranian principle or whatever other principle. He's excuse me. He's very good at referencing things back to that, and he's very good at outlining or using that type of verbiage to outline his worldview, which is more or less present all throughout this book, where you can see the very clearly defined lines of what is right and what is wrong, not even in the moral sense, but what in the truly proper sense, or in the dharmic sense, or even in the praxis sense, if you would consider
virtuous way that he mentioned too in Polar Symbolism.
Yeah. Which Polar Symbolism is going to be the first chapter that we deal with today. So I guess we could just jump right into that. Would you have anything else to say before we do?
No, let's get right into it.
All right. So Polar Symbolism. So the Evola deals with polar symbolism in two different ways throughout this book, or not even throughout this book, but throughout his writing. He references it in two different ways. The first way is the way he talks about it in this chapter, which is the way in which you would picture kind of a point of centrality throughout a sphere, or I guess it's more of like an axis around which everything turns. Or as like the pivot point around which the whole universe kind of revolves. And then there's the second way, which is less formal, and it's more it's less informal, I guess, and more formal. It's more dedicated to form. The second way he references the polar symbolism is by referencing the actual poles of the world. So like the North Pole, for example, he'll reference like Hyperborea and stuff like that. So when he talks about polar symbolism, sometimes he's referencing symbolism of the pole or of the North Pole, and sometimes he's referencing this axis of the world. So it depends on the context, and you'll kind of have to get a feel for it later on. But this idea of the pole goes throughout his entire philosophy. I kind of don't know why he put the idea here first. I actually do think this idea would have been better expounded upon with other evidence or other information to back it up first, because this text is kind of geared towards maybe the novice, or as someone who's trying to be introduced to these topics. And when I came across this, I didn't understand quite what he was getting at, because I hadn't read the chapters that come after this. I think you've had more exposure to...
Oh, excuse me.
Oh, I was going to say, you've had, I think, more exposure to, writing like this outside of this, and concepts like this outside of this, so you probably were able to grasp it better than I was when I first found it. But, go ahead and give your thoughts.
I disagree with you slightly in the order in which he made the book, because I think it was a very good idea to have the polar symbolism be this early on in its chapters. It, like the whole point of the chapter it's a point of centrality to kind of start from. It isn't the very first thing he delves into, whether that was his foreword or the first two chapters. Those kind of gave context to more ethereal, like broader pieces, and then he puts it down to a refined point, which is this centerpiece. And the thing he starts off with in the chapter is the Hindu idea of the Chakravartin, and that's the archetypal king of kings, and this virtuous center pole from which all other things revolve around. And it's, like you mentioned before, a point of like an axle, because he brings up things like the symbolism in scepters and many Greek terminologies like eklikiostis genesios, hard to pronounce stuff, excuse us. But it's usually revolving around, pun not intended, a central point and a type of wheel or some sort of orbiting systems, like planetary functions or even like a zodiac type of function, which he doesn't bring either of those two examples in the chapter, but they could very easily be applied to what he's talking about in this central role as a person, or in a broader spiritual sense, a deity at the center of the universe, from which the foundations of reality or the foundations of society are being based off of. If you want to jump in from there.
Yeah. So, I guess I forgot to mention that the title itself of the chapter is called Polar Symbolism, the Lord of Peace and Justice. And so the first part of the chapter kind of deals with what polar symbolism means in this context, and then what the Lord of Peace and Justice means. But yeah, so he brought up Cody brought up the Cockroach of Arton, and that's that quite literally means the universal king, which is in Hindu what that connotes to. So he says here that the Cakravartin may be considered the archetype of the regal function, of which various kings represent more or less complete images or even particular expressions whenever they conform to the traditional principle. And so then he says Cakravartin literally means lord or spinner of the wheel. And this notion brings us again back to the idea of a center that corresponds to an inner state. So it's not only symbolic, but it quite literally has a specific literal meaning as well, as either the ruler or the lord, or of the spinner of the wheel, which has that symbolic meaning to it. So it brings us back to an inner state, a way of being, or better yet, to the way of being, with a capital B. Referenced in the first chapter as the between being and becoming. And so he says that the wheel symbolizes samsara, or the stream of becoming. And he says the Hellenes called it, there's a Greek word here I can't read, but basically the wheel of generation. So the Hellenes called it the wheel of generation, or the wheel of fate. And he says that
that was the Kyklos tis geniosos.
Oh, yeah.
The one I mentioned before.
Okay, yeah.
I probably butchered that still, but
it's good to have some pronunciation in there anyways, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so the Greeks called it the wheel of generation, or the wheel of fate, or what he calls the stream of becoming, which is basically the constant motion, or the consistently moving aspect of our temporal world, where you can't stop time, you can't stop things from moving. However, if you contrast this with the realm of being, or with the metaphysical realm, in which everything exists as an absolute ontological truth, in which there are no such thing as events or anything that transpires, because there's no time, there's no temporality, there's no movement to it. The meaning becomes clear then. So he says that the wheel's motionless center signifies the spiritual stability inherent in those who are not afflicted by this stream, and who can organize and subject to a higher principle the energies and activities connected to the inferior nature. Then the Cakravartin appears as the Dharmaraja, the Lord of the Law, or the Lord of the Wheel of the Law. And so that goes back to this idea of basically the center point of the wheel and the axis around which everything turns, and the pivot point, and all of that we've just discussed. And so one last point that he goes into here is, he says, according to Confucius, the practice of government by means of virtue may be compelled to the pole star, which the multitudinous stars pay homage to while it stays in its place. Hence the meaning of the concept of revolution, which is the motion occurring around an unmoved mover, though in our modern day and age it's become synonymous with subversion. Which is an interesting point that he makes, because it goes back to that political idea of revolution and things by which most people would consider today to be occurring from the bottom strata of society, the lowest strata of society, faced upwards. This idea of revolution is faced inwards, from the most absolute sphere of society to the most stable, if that makes sense.
And that's also important, too, in the perceptions of these things as well, because it's important that Evola used that framing of revolution in our modern context, as a means of subversion, because our perceptions of something like revolution is, like Vincent said, a bottom-up upheaval of the structure that was pre-existent. But if you know anything about elite theory and the other surrounding philosophers around Evola and himself, you'd know that many of these cases, pretty much all of them, involve a separate set of elites that are already at the top of society, that are using the masses as a lever or as an axle themselves to subvert the current reigning elite system on whatever system it's in. And that could be not just governmental, like thinking about something like the French Revolution and how that was a genuine subversion of, French history and its effects worldwide thereof. But it also could be in a religious context as well. And you could see that with so many reformations and revolutions that happened within just the Christian churches and in all the different sects that have come out because of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so good. Those are good examples. And so the idea that he's talking about here with the concept of revolution, he's talking about more or less a sacred and symbolic meaning than one of upheaval, like you say. So you would think of things like the cycles of time could be a revolution, or the cycles of the earth could be a revolution, or something, around an unmoved center could be considered as that revolution. And so the thing revolving, or the thing doing the moving, that is that stream of becoming, which is the metaphor or symbol for what we call temporal reality or physical reality, in which things are not stable, in which things are moving. And so this unmoved center, this axle or this pivot point, this is what is represented by the king, who has lordship over that point. So he is able to command the things that are moving around him, because he can command that point itself, because he stays stable. And it also kind of corresponds to an inner stability or an inner peace, which we'll get onto later in the chapter, which also has that same meaning but applied individually. So he says, in this sense, royalty assumes the value of a pole by referring to a general traditional symbolism. We may recall here, besides Midgard, the heavenly middle abode described in Nordic traditions. Plato references the place where Zeus holds counsel with the gods in order to reach a decision concerning the fate of Atlantis. He accordingly summoned all the gods to his most glorious abode, which stands at the center of the universe and looks out over the whole realm of change. The above-mentioned notion of Cakravartin is also connected to a cycle of enigmatic traditions concerning the real existence of a center of the world that exercises this supreme function here on Earth. Some fundamental symbols of regality had originally had a close relationship with these ideas. So, basically, he's talking about, again, the various symbolisms you can find in other cultures. Like you said, Nordic tradition calls themselves Nordic tradition calls the earth that we live in Midgard, or the middle abode. I think later on he references China being, or considering itself, the middle empire, or the center of the world.
Yeah, the Middle Kingdom it calls itself.
Oh yeah, the Middle Kingdom. Okay, yeah. I don't know if you mentioned that in this paragraph or in a different one, but it's the same general idea. And if you look at various other cultures, you'll find that same idea of there being this unmoved center. And if you even look at the symbol of Plotinus's monad, or the Neo-Platonists' monad, it is essentially a circle with a dot in the middle, and that dot in the middle is supposed to signify that unmoved center. And so that's what the wheel symbolizes. That's what polar symbolism means. And so
you can even, if I may, you can even apply these concepts to more physical aspects of reality, and how these concepts reinforce the idea of a more spiritually centered reality that we have, that there is an unmoved mover orchestrating, the cosmic clockwork, as it were, because these concepts are as fundamental as particles, like the atom, and they have their nucleatic center, something as simple as hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe, with its usually one electron orbiting around it. And without radical external force exerting itself on that atom, it will always remain that way. Or even in larger scales, cosmic bodies like our solar system or our galaxy, and how those centers are so steadfast, and how the planets revolve around the sun, and how the sun revolves around the center of our galaxy, and so on and so forth, up to the entire universe, possibly pointing towards some deity of some kind that has put all of this momentum into action.
Yeah, yeah. And it kind of puts to rest that idea of the universe having no center. Simply by symbolic virtue, there would have to be a type of center around which all motion is occurring. There's this idea of the unmoved mover, even in Christian theology, which is something I was going to get at as well. Because he says that, Evola says up in the top, in one of the first paragraphs, he mentions an unmoved mover. And that's one of the same arguments that Thomas Aquinas gave for God actually existing, is that, God exists as an unmoved mover, not in a chronological or temporal sense, or in an accidental sense, in which accidental motion is given to a being by something else, and then that accidental object stays in motion, is able to provide motion insofar as it's still moving and stuff like that. Thomas Aquinas was talking about essential motion, in the sense that anything that is in motion right now is being pushed by a more fundamental member in a sequence, and that this sequence has a most fundamental member, and that is what is considered to be God. So even in Christian theology, this idea of the unmoved mover, or of the center of the universe, or of something of that sort, is considered to be valid even in that sense. So
yeah, and I was even going to mention that Jesus, like I said when we first started the chapter, is this Kakravartin character in the Christian theology. And sometimes I feel odd referring to Jesus as a character, but just for the point of conversation, try not to get too upset over that, because you all get it. You're intelligent enough. I trust you. But he is that king of kings, in a sense, this center point in the soul and in the universe, sitting on the right hand of God the Father, and then there's the Holy Spirit as well, and there's this centrality in this trifecta that they have in the different embodiments of God, and that almost kind of gets into the sacred geometry and things like this, which are related to these points of centrality and regality and the axiomatic aspects of the universe.
Yeah. So so he says the same symbolism is embodied in the ziggurat. Did you mention the ziggurat? I thought I heard that in there somewhere.
I don't believe I did, no.
Oh, okay. Well, I was kind of reading as you were talking, so I didn't know if I read it or heard it. Anyways, so he says that the same symbolism is embodied in the ziggurat, the Assyrian-Babylonian terraced pyramid. Which...
Just before you move on further, though.
Oh, okay.
That explanation you were giving with the, not of consequence or accident, the chronological process of God being the unmoved mover.
Yeah.
I recognize where you were formulating those words from. If anyone does need a more refined explanation of these proofs, and they are kind of like mathematical proofs of these theological concepts, look up a channel on YouTube called Mathoma. We'll probably link it in the description as well. He gives a whole series called In Defense of Classical Theology.
Yeah.
Very, very good, very well refined, and we've even used that to help better our understanding of our own religious experience.
Yeah, it's a very good intro into theology, I would say, and it really helps.
You were saying about ziggurats, though.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry, my bad. There's the delay still.
Yeah, I know what you mean. But yeah, the series really does help explain certain things in mathematical verbiage, and I would say that it, at the very least, serves as a point of introduction into thinking mathematically about the universe. and the channel itself is based on math, so I guess that's one of the reasons why, right? But actually, kind of corresponding with math, Evola says that the same symbolism is embodied in the ziggurat, which is the Assyrian-Babylonian terraced pyramid, as well as in the master plan of the capital of the Persian kings. But you're mentioning sacred geometry and mathematics and stuff, and that's one of the things about the pyramids is that they were built with this very geometric form on purpose to kind of correspond to some sacred meaning, which had to do very much with mathematics and geometry and aligning with the stars and things like that. So there's a lot more to the math of the ancients than meets the eye. Even now, I think they're still aligned with the stars, thousands of years later. So there was
they actually built in, if I do recall properly, many of these what would you call it, great wonders of the ancient world were built with a adjustment to how the earth was moving. So they built them slightly off intentionally from perfect alignment with the celestial bodies, like the Great Pyramids and the Belt of Orion, so that over the course of the millennia, it will still be in a line with it until many millennia later, and our planet moving through the galaxy kind of takes it off from that alignment.
Right. Yeah, which is very interesting. Very interesting stuff. So yeah, he says, in these places we find the architectural expression of cosmic order, complete in its hierarchy and its dependence upon an unmoved center. So, same stuff. From a spatial perspective, this center corresponded, within the building itself, to the king's throne. So we have this idea again of the Kakravartin, or of the universal king. And so, we've already said that the universal king, or the Kakravartin, is the archetype of the function of regality. And so this is why, right? Because the regal being is able to dominate over this unmoved center, or of this axis. That is what separates them from the masses, is their ability to achieve this this feat of dominion, really. And so, let's see. It is interesting that the ziggurat, the sacred building towering above the city-state of which it was the center, was called cornerstone in Babylon and link between heaven and earth in Lhasa. The theme of the rock and of the bridge is pretty much summed up in the Far Eastern expression, third power between heaven and earth. So it's the same idea. Now, I mentioned earlier that the idea of polar symbolism goes along with an inner stability or an inner peace, and the chapter itself is titled "The Lord of Peace and Justice," and so in this second part of the chapter here, this is what Evola gets at. He goes, the importance of these traces and correlations should not be overlooked. Moreover, stability has the same double dimension. It is at the center of the Indo-Aryan formula for the consecration of kings. And then in the formulas of Egyptian royalty, stability appears as an essential attribute that complements the attribute of the power life already present in the sovereign. And so he gives an Indo-Aryan. He gives the actual quote for the Indo-Aryan consecration, which is, "Remain steady and unwavering. Do not give in. Be strong like a mountain. Stay still like the sky and the earth, and retain control of power at all times. The sky, the earth, and the mountains are unmoved, as unmoved is the world of living beings and this king of men." And so that is that initiation ritual for the king. So this idea of the wheel and of the pole corresponds to an idea of a center, which also corresponds to an idea of stability, because that wheel is that unmoved center. It's that stable center of any other thing around it. And so it does correspond with an inner stability or an inner peace that the ruler is supposed to possess within himself, or that higher caste individual is supposed to possess within himself, which is what gives them the capability of saying that they are part of that higher caste. He goes on to say that the Olympian attribute, moreover, and the attribute of peace are connected to the condition of stability in the esoteric sense of the word. Kings who derive their power from the supreme God and who have received victory at his hands are lighthouses of peace in the storm. And he says, after glory, centrality, and stability, peace is one of the fundamental attributes of regality that has been preserved until relatively recent times. And he's correct about that too. He says Dante talked about the Imperator Pacificus, a title previously bestowed upon Charlemagne. Obviously, this is not the profane and social peace pursued by political government, which is a kind of peace that, at most, is an external consequence, but rather an inner and positive peace, which should not be divorced from the triumphal element. So, again, this peace within oneself is also connotative of that stability or of that steadfastness that the king must have, or that the regal being must have. Any thoughts?
It actually, yes, a bit, because he goes on a little bit later too, with the presupposition of a higher power of knowledge and capacity for wisdom, which is similar to what the Vedic tradition says about Krishna in this sense, and the virtue of the highest form of knowing God and spirituality and knowing the center being a sagely wisdom, and that those in the Kakravartin and these other positions of high regality understand concepts about the world, or just have this instinctual basis on which they operate that goes above just base level reality. And Evola mentions people like Plato, who gets at these concepts as well, and the hierarchy of man, with philosophers being at the top of society, and those who are the wisest are meant for this path to be on that interpole position, like how Jesus said why he speaks in parables, that only few will know him and accept him, and the same is true in the Vedic tradition, what Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita. And it seems like all these intersecting traditions from completely independent of each other all point in the same direction.
Yeah.
Reinforces the aspect of this goal that must be adhered to, and what when society goes into modernity falls out of.
Yeah. You know what you were saying kind of is summed up perfectly by the last paragraph or the last sentence in the paragraph. He says, this piece does not convey the notion of cessation, but rather that of the highest degree of perfection of a pure, inner, and withdrawn activity. It is a calm that reveals the supernatural. And so, again, it is not a piece of... sorry, just move the mic a little bit. But it is not a piece of... of being removed from something, or it is not a piece of opting out of something, and it is also not a piece of docility, but it is a, again, I guess the way Evola said it is best, it is a calm, it is a type of tranquility that allows one to see the world as it is. It allows for reflection as well. There's that Chinese proverb. Is that what you're going to say?
No, it's that sageliness I mentioned of the sage being the one in the Vedic tradition who's closest to God on their path for, wisdom.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's also like that. What is it? The Chinese proverb that you said, where you can't see your face in a pot of boiling water. It's like that. You can't see your reflection in a pot of boiling water.
Yes, yeah.
It's exactly like that.
Yeah, it's that cool reflection to not let your anger or other emotions contaminate your thought, but that's not to be void of those emotions altogether too, because they will guide you in what is just and proper in the dharma, as the Vedic tradition calls it, the law of nature.
Yeah, in a sense, this stability and this peace and this centrality to oneself allows a person to see. It allows a person to see themselves with kind of a God's eye view and understand what it is about themselves, or at least from a third perspective, and allows them to understand certain aspects about themselves or certain aspects about reality or other things. And this path is, again, as you said, with Jesus in the parables or with the Hindu notion, or with any notion of esotericism in general, this true knowledge, this gnosis, as it were, is only available to a select few who can actually grasp and understand it intellectually and intuitively. It's not something that can so much be taught, but is a latent capability that one possesses, that one needs to either be initiated into to kind of fully flourish, or to fully give, to fully bear its fruits, or something of that nature, where it has to be completely realized. But it's not something that can be taught, and it's not something that one who is born without it can get. It is purely an intuitive intuition, or it's intuitive intellection.
It's kind of like, to bring it down to a normie understanding of it. It's like in D&D, if you're building your character and you're rolling your stats for wisdom, you roll a 20 for that category, and now that's that intuitive nature of things that your character has.
Right.
It's kind of like a rolling of the cosmic dice for these individuals that possess that capability in the real world.
Right, exactly. But that's not to say that it is a roll of the dice. He goes on here later to say that everything that transpires that is the result of a superimposition isn't necessarily anything done by chance. So, someone being born into a certain caste isn't because they rolled the dice and then got put into that caste randomly. It's because before they were born, the essence that made up their spirit, or their soul, more or less, that was put into their body, was of that caste, of the body that they were being put into. So it was supposed to be this this very mapped out idea of fate up until you reach the point of temporality, in which you had to then be subject to choice. So we get into that later, way later in the book. But that is a good way to put it.
And there are
this concept.
Sorry about that, and then there are the rare cases of people traversing up the caste system, whether that be a Western or Eastern perspective of it, or even transcending it altogether, and having that God's eye view, like Vincent said, to really look at reality beyond just our temporal means.
Yeah, that's what the idea of regality is. Now, one thing, this is kind of tangential, but one thing that I find, and this is true of Ganon as well. So, we mentioned last episode that Evola was a spiritual successor of Ganon, and Ganon was more or less his teacher, not his master, more or less, but his spiritual predecessor, I guess, is the best way to put it. So these two go very well hand in hand with each other. Ganon was more focused with ontological reality and timeless essential principles, and Evola was more concerned with Evola was more concerned with what is formal. He was more concerned with the formal tradition, or with the descent of society into modernity. I would very much consider Evola a good travel guide in the Kali Yuga type of guy, whereas Ganon, I would consider him more or less a type of I guess a philosopher proper, because he's dealing with all of these mathematical concepts. I guess Ganon is more of a theologian, and Evola is more of a sociologian, if that's how it may be put. But Ganon has this idea of the ordering of society, and when they mention a regal caste, he considers that to be the priest caste on top. So he basically suggests that the priest caste is the best caste and is the most fit to lead. And Evola counters that with a view that the warrior caste is the caste that is best fit to lead. And that is what's referenced when the regal caste is mentioned, is an initiated warrior class. But I think that both of these guys miss the point, in the sense that the truly regal caste, those top tier individuals, those era defining individuals, or the true leaders, or however you may want to put it, are not of a caste. They are that transcendent of the caste. They transcend that limitation of caste, and they go beyond it. I don't think that's a consideration that they made, and I could be completely wrong on it, but that's my interpretation of it, is that these regal people do go above and beyond that notion of caste that limits everyone else to that one specific area. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, 100% agree. And it's an issue with trying to categorize, these vast swaths of people, the millions and billions of rabble and regality amongst mankind in history, because many times there are not exceptions, but rarer formulations of persons or peoples that are a fusion of different castes, or even a what would you say, like a transcendent persona from the caste system that they belong to in the first place. Like one of the friends that I just stayed with on my road trip was from India, and he was from Kashmir, where Sikhs mostly live, and Sikhs as a people are this fusion between warrior and priest, and historically that's how they've always operated, where they're very bold and boisterous, and have defended the western edge of the empire of India, but they've also been very learned men. They've been high spiritual men, and are in the top rungs of the caste in India. There is some diffusion there, and separation with Sikhs from the regular Hindu population of the rest of India, but it's definitely an interesting example of this fusion of different castes that are exhibited in a whole tradition of people.
Mm-hmm. It is, and that's the thing, right? Is that I don't necessarily see caste as these very rigid, well-defined lines. I see them as more of a gradient, that one fades into the other as it goes up a sort of hierarchy. So you can have these priests that do dabble in the warrior capabilities, and you have a lot of warriors who dabble in those priestly capabilities, and the idea of
many that dabble in the merchants.
Exactly, and you have these ideas of kings, especially in the medieval era, who weren't supposed to just be a warrior, but they were also supposed to know the gospel. They were supposed to be able to communicate with God. So they were supposed to be both warrior and priest. They were also supposed to know how to farm, and how to hunt, and how to manage the economy. So they were supposed to know how to be that peasantry caste who is also supposed to know how to farm and hunt. Also of that merchant caste who was supposed to deal with economics. So the king was really supposed to be a jack of all trades, and he was supposed to know how to do it well. That was the ideal king. So it wasn't just a king of a priestliness or a king of warriorness. It was a king of everythingness. You were supposed to be the regal individual. And so that's what I think that this regality is supposed to define, is not necessarily, one caste or another. It's all of the castes. It is beyond the caste. If one thing is a fusion of all things, it is beyond that thing. And so that's what I think regality gets at here. And I don't think, Evola and Guénon never really settle on that argument, but they do reference it as the regal caste. I'll get into it in a second. Say what you want to say?
Yeah, that is what Evola was kind of saying with the Dharmaraja in this instance, where that's kind of what it is, the king of justice, or universal king in this aspect, where they're a notch above a jack of all trades, where they can do everything well and competent, though they may not be experts. They have the air of leadership where they can reign over all these different aspects of human society and be fair and just and lead their people into a stable center. And that's what kind of transitions into the next chapter, the law of state and empire, if you want to jump into there.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of symbolizes someone who can pick something up and have never done it before, but intuitively know how to do it well within the first hour or so. It's like that type of individual. Um, but yeah, okay. So he goes into the law of the state and the empire. Now this one deals with the political principle. This is chapter 4, the law of the state and the empire. So this one deals with the idea of politics and of statehood and basically the ordering of society in a political manner. So it starts off with the sentence: the traditional society's view of both the law and the state is closely related to the order of ideas that I've been discussing so far. Generally speaking, a transcendent realism is the presupposition for the traditional notion of the law. Especially in Aryan formulations, the notion of the law has an intimate relationship with the notions of truth, reality, and stability inherent to quote-unquote that which is. In the Vedas, the term Rita is often the same meaning as Dharma. It not only signifies the order found in the world as order, but it also has a deeper meaning whenever it designates truth, law, or reality, just as the opposite, Anrita, designates falsehood, evil, or unreality. Thus, the world of the law, and consequently of the state, came to be equated with the world of truth and of reality in the eminent sense of the word. Which reminds me, I had a note for the last chapter before we ended, which there's a quote right here on the last one of the last paragraphs, which he says, where is it?
That was Plato's conclusion?
No, it was actually tying it into Praxism. He says, oh yeah, he says, in fact, dharma in Sanskrit also means quote-unquote proper nature of, or the law typical of a given being. So if we
that's what I mentioned before.
Yeah, so if we consider, Praxism with that same etymology as being that proper operation of something within itself, we use almost the same verbiage here. So you can see that, certain, I guess, certain divine interpretations kind of result within the same conclusions. Coming to these conclusions separately, but in the same fashion and through the same methods. So what we reference as Praxism, the Hindus might reference as Dharma, or we've spoken of it elsewhere. But there's also the Egyptian notion of Mat and various other conceptions which relate to cosmic truth and order, or, well, quote unquote, the proper operation of something within itself, basically. But I just thought that'd be a cool, interesting tidbit to throw that in there and tie it back into us. But going back to chapter 4 now. So basically what I just read was the intro paragraph to the law of the state and the empire. And what it essentially means is just that, the law has a notion of reality to itself that is higher than any mortal being is able to debate with. So he says, as a natural consequence, traditional man either ignored or considered absurd the idea that one could talk about laws and the obedience due them if the laws in question had a mere human origin, whether individual or collective. Every law, in order to be regarded as an objective law, had to have a divine character. Once the divine character of a law was sanctioned and its origin traced back to a non-human tradition, then its authority became absolute. This law became something ineffable, inflexible, immutable, and beyond criticism. And thus every transgression of such law was regarded not so much as a crime against society, but rather and foremost as a sacrilege, or as an act of impiety, or as an act that jeopardized the spiritual destiny of the person who disobeyed it, as well as the people with whom that person was socially related. This is why, up to and including medieval civilization, rebellion against authority and the imperial law was considered just as serious a crime as religious heresy. Thus the rebels were considered just like heretics, namely, as the enemies of their own natures, and beings who contradict the law of their very own being. Ancient Aryan India employed a special expression to designate those who broke the caste law. They were called the fallen ones, or the lapsed, more on which later, which he does get to. So basically he says that in order for something to be considered a law, it had to be absolute, and it had to correspond, again, to what we would call that absolute notion of the quintessential truth. It had to be derived in some way from an absolute notion of truth to reality that is now being applied to a given being that now that given being has to spontaneously follow. The law was a way in which that person would be enforced to follow something that was essentially good for them. The political law, in a sense, in the way he's describing it, is the way in which the individual law of oneself, or the praxism of oneself, the praxism of a given person, of a given caste, or a given individual, or whatever it may be, the law is the way in which that is fulfilled, if that makes sense. What are your thoughts?
I'm kind of going to go on how that has degraded in modernity, and why that's so important, because so many people have this mentality, like the Big Lebowski quote, "That's just your opinion, man," about most things. And you might cite, these fundamental concepts of reality to a person, and they'll go, "Well, that's just your opinion." And that's happened to me more than once, and it's very aggravating, because you're trying to inform these people that it's not something that you necessarily even agree with. That's just how the world and the universe works in general. And it's that devolution from these fundamental truths and these higher laws of being, arraigned by God himself to justify how we act in society, in state. And that's why you even look at texts as modern as the Constitution of the United States, where these rights are endowed by the creator of man, and Congress shall make no law infringing on these rights, type of deal. It is the idea was to protect the whims of man from going beyond the law of God, type of deal. And the founders did their best to try and avoid that, but modernity takes hold regardless in the ever moving march of time. So now we're in the position where, war is peace, or right is wrong, type of inversions of everything, including in these concepts of fundamental laws of reality.
If I may, yeah, it was John Adams, I believe. Was it John Adams? One of them who said, what was it? Our Constitution is founded for a religious population, and it is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. And that's because what they interpreted as, you see, what they did was the founding fathers, and this is probably one of their biggest flaws, is that they wrote down all of the things that they were free to do, but they didn't codify anything that they were not free to do, because that was already implicit within their religious laws that they were already following from an institution that is outside their government. So that idea of secularism go ahead.
I just wanted to add the same applies to philosophers like John Locke, whom the founders based much of their own thinking off of. And contemporary people on our sphere of things, like Carl Benjamin, who's a very notorious liberal himself, and defends these classical liberal ideas, has even stated these same conclusions, that these people were writing from the perspective that reality must operate under these religious guises, and operate under these presuppositions, these a priori fundamental ideals that that man must abide by, and be necessarily constrained by, because it will just devolve into chaos. And that's what Evola wrote here too, in the orientation of Aryan India and these other concepts surrounding an order to society, where there is a rigidity to it, but it operates under a necessary facet to have people function. And we see how eroding those rigidities turn into chaos, and turn into disillusionment, and turn into divisive, violent acts that don't have any real ideal behind them. It's just the masses lashing out at a lack of order to their lives and to the lives around them.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this idea of, going back to kind of what I said, you're bringing up Carl Benjamin and the interpretation of John Locke and all of these stuff. I can very much see where they're coming at with this idea of religious freedom, because it does make sense when you when you understand it as when you understand it in the confines of perennialism, right? Or by the semantics of perennialism, that all of these religious traditions are justified insofar as they manifest certain qualities about reality that are proper to follow, and that you should at least choose one of them. Religious freedom in a country like the United States, with the Constitution giving such freedoms and all of that stuff, makes sense. But the thing is, the Constitution never stated you should have a religion. It basically said you are free to not have a religion. And this a-religiosity, this secularism, this atheism took hold. And so now all of the freedoms granted by the Constitution were taken with none of the responsibilities. And so now, again, you have
and even that right there, to stop you real quick, you've even fallen into the trap of modernity itself, too, because it's not freedoms that the Constitution granted. It's freedoms that the Constitution wanted to protect. And it's this exactly what Evola is saying, that it's these laws of man that are now being used to justify new laws, air quote, for this new chaotic civilization, instead of, the fundamental axiom, which is this divine rule, this divine light from which everything is justified on. And instead, people are now, on both the right and the left-wing contemporary party system, on using the Constitution to justify different things, different rights that they think they have, when they're not rights whatsoever. And that comes down to both the conservative and liberal side of things, or whatever flavor of individualistic politic you want to ascribe to.
Yeah. So the notion of law for the capital T traditionalist point of view essentially contradicts or negates all of that. I would say it even negates the ideas put forth in the Constitution, because these laws, those laws came from not necessarily from religious law, but from, first of all, Protestant understanding of religiosity, but second of all, Anglo-Saxon or old Anglo-Saxon law that you could trace back to the Magna Carta. But regardless, the traditional view of the law was much different. It was a very, very rigid system of trying to reference a non-human, like Evola said, a non-human character to something, and then attributing that to a codified version of itself. So that's where I draw the line. Oh, go ahead.
All right, no, you finish. My mistake.
I was going to say, that's where I draw the line between law and policy, whereas law is something you can not refute, and it is something that is beyond morality, and it is not necessarily immoral to break them, because it is, I guess it is immoral to break them, but it is much more so a transgression against certain truths of reality to break them than it is just a problem of moral right and wrong. So it's beyond immoral to break them. It is, again, a transgression of certain truths. So policy would be something that is decided by man, where it is moral. It's a morally gray area where it doesn't necessarily correspond to a certain truth, and it has to deal with the here and now. Policy is what is dealt with in everyday lives, and law is what is dealt with ontologically. I guess that's what I would characterize it as.
Or as Nietzsche might say, beyond good and evil in a type of way. Though he was almost going in an inversion of what Evola was getting at in his lamentation of that aspect. But what I wanted to say before was, I think I've had a bit of an epiphany in these concepts being applied to our state of modernity, and kind of understand where the elites that are of the ruling class right now are coming from. It's just that they are coming from such a materialistic, atheistic point of view, where, like you were saying yourself, Vincent, that you get how the liberal interpretation or proposition of these ideas of religious freedom or things might work in these more idealistic times or circumstances. But I think that would work for the higher class, the philosopher, king at the top of society, these Dharmahaja, if I said that, Dharmaraja, I think it was, yes.
Yeah.
Those types of people who, like the perennialists get at, could ascribe to any one religious tradition, even if it's not necessarily in alignment with the population's religious tradition that they rule over. But the more fundamental truth is that they all kind of get that they're all pointing towards the same fundamental truths, and that they can still apply those truths that are exhibited around the world and throughout history to their populations in which they rule over, and rule them justly, so that those people have their guidance, but they still have the traditional or the religious tradition that they are used to and operate under.
Yeah.
And this globalist conception of leaders operating under those presumptions, these, like a conversation about the Matrix being this almost approximation of the esoteric ideal and retelling of the Bible, but failing because they hit that materialistic wall, is the same on what our elites in like the whole New World Order or World Economic Forum mentality are struggling with. They want these things to happen in the way they do because they have these high ideals, this futurism and technocracy and the singularity that they're all trying to get at. But the purposes, the motivations on what they're trying to do getting there, operating under the assumption that they have good intentions to get to these goals. Some of them, we can tell, don't. But assuming that most of them do, there is an understanding on why they're trying to do that. What they're failing to realize is that there are powers far beyond them, or they do realize that, but they're so arrogant and egotistical they think they can exert control and will over the world in reality beyond which they are mortally capable of. And so that's why they push these agendas of almost immortalizing themselves in a way and getting into this technocratic singularity that they have in mind. Whereas in a more Platonic or Platoistic conception of the world, where you have these philosopher kings that can be Muslim or Hindu or Christian or Buddhist, but whatever flavor of religion they come from traditionally or that they've converted to, they all agree on the fundamental truths that all of their religions depict. Mm-hmm. And that would be a world where these elites might be able to get along, not necessarily get along, but coordinate with each other in a more functional, orderly world in this globalistic mentality than the elites we currently have are trying to do, because they're also atheistic and materialistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would be a spiritual type of world order than it would be an economic one, which we see right now. And I think that would be, if we were to go through hypotheticals, that would probably be the best case scenario, is that, that is what we wind up with, is that is with a world order. You're probably not going to shy away from the idea of communication with other nations around the world, especially with, modernity being the way it is, and technology being the way it is. And even if we were to reverse our mentalities to a religious mentality, that doesn't mean that all of that buildup, all of that positive buildup, which is still so much shrouded by the negative buildup, doesn't mean that would go away. It wouldn't be a reversion of technology, and it wouldn't be necessarily a reversion of lifestyle. I guess it would be in a certain sense, wouldn't it? But not to the degree of losing all types of communication with other with other nations. So with that being the case, the best case scenario would be to have these, regal figures of each nation or of each group of people. I don't like using the word nation because it implies nationalism. But using the regal heads of each region or of each group of people to as kind of that representative figure of the monarchies of old, or of the aristocracies of old, or however you'd like to put it, being that type of ambassador to one another, or having positive relations with one another based on the things that they agree upon. That is probably best case scenario. But we're going off kind
I
of
think
into
you'll have a...
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. You wanted to finish?
I was going to say, I think we're going off into the weeds here with this conversation, but I was going to get us back on track.
Well, because it still operates under the ideas of the state. Maybe not in what Evola's trying to get at, but related to, the consequences of modernity that we exist in, and applying his word to our lived reality right now.
Yeah.
Although I would be careful with that. Lived reality is a progressive, neo-Marxist type of vocabulary. Try to avoid those. But I guess you can't really avoid a nationalism of sorts in certain degrees, because you're always going to have in-groups and out-groups, and you'll have ethnic and state relations that, peoples form, and you'll have those elites on top that have to rule over and defend those nations or states or so that would have to interact with each other, like you were saying, which aren't necessarily a bad thing, because they have different traditions and perspectives which are useful to keep and propagate. I would
put a sticky note in what you just said, because Evola does touch upon nationalism in the medieval world and what it means, and you are correct. Yeah, we'll put a stock in that. I'm guessing. I know what you mean, and the reason I try to refrain from using nationalistic type rhetoric is because it lowers it down to that third estate type of nationalism that you'd see being so popular right now. I guess it lowers it to populist nationalism and not nationality.
I totally understand.
Yeah.
It's like what Evola said about revolution, and how that term its connotation is moved towards subversion.
Yeah.
Nationalistic identities are on the same direction.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so picking up where I left off on reading, what's funny is the next sentence kind of helps me justify what I said about law and policy. He says the usefulness of the law in the modern sense of the word, that is, its collective and empirical usefulness, was never the true criterion adopted in ancient times. Not that this aspect was never considered, but it was rather thought to be accessory or a consequential aspect in every law, once the law was sanctioned as true. So that utilitarian element of creating a law was considered secondary to its metaphysical implications. I don't want to say moral implications, because moral takes a step down and kind of plays with different concepts on an equal playing field, whereas metaphysics certainly raises that notion of the law above morality, above that equitarian plane on which various policies kind of debate with each other. So the difference between law and policy, again, I would say, is law is that absolute, unchanging, once it's ratified type of idea, whereas policy is that contingent rule that is based upon more or less circumstantial factors, if that makes sense. But kind of moving on, he says, moreover, laws and institutions, as in the case of all traditional civilizations, were both from above and oriented upwards. A political, economic, and social order created merely for the sake of temporal life is exclusively characteristic of the modern world, that is, of the anti-traditional world. So it kind of gets at what we were talking about. Traditionally, the state had a transcendent meaning and purpose that were not inferior to the ones the Catholic Church claimed for itself in the West as a manifestation of and a path to the world above. The very term state, in Latin status, from the Greek... Yeah, the very term... so he says basically the very term state in Latin status from the Greek, I'm going to guess is something that sounds like state, which he says means to stay, empirically may have derived from the form of social life taken up by the nomadic populations once they permanently settled down. However, it may also point to a higher meaning, namely to an order concerned with a hierarchical participation in a spiritual stability, as opposed to the contingent, unstable, changeable, chaotic, and particularistic character of a naturalistic existence. The order constituted the accurate reflection of the world of being in the world of becoming. Hence, the words pronounced in the course of a Vedic royal consecration: "The world of the living is steady, and so is this king of the people." In this way, traditional states and empires often employed the symbols of centrality and of polarity that have been associated with the archetype of regality. So he goes back to that polar symbolism a little bit. Here we go. So this next paragraph, he says, "Thus, while the ancient Chinese empire was called the Middle Empire, and the seat of the world, according to Nordic legend, was called Midgard, the middle abode, or the center of the world, or the capital of the Incas' solar empire was called Cuzco, or navel of the world. Likewise, in ancient Greece, Delphi enjoyed the same designation as the center of Doric civilization. It would be easy to find analogous references in different civilizations, all pointing to an ancient meaning of traditional states and organizations. Generally speaking, in prehistoric times, the symbolism of sacred stones already points to the same order of ideas, the alleged fetishism of the cult of the stones, partially being a mere fancy of modern researchers." So basically, he goes into the idea again of centrality, or of the capital city, or of the main culture hub or the main social hub of a given empire being that center of the world, or the center of the universe, even in some cases. It's again that same polar symbolism. Let's see. The rest of the chapter is kind of more or less different examples of the one principle that we just talked about, which I think we've kind of expounded upon, with our interpretation of it.
We've exhausted.
Yeah. So with that, I think we can move on to the next chapter, which is chapter 5, The Mystery of the Rite. Would you say that was a good time?
Yeah.
All right. Perfect. So the Mystery of the Rite. Let's see. This chapter has to do with... so basically, the thesis for this chapter is every event that happens in the physical world has some type of accordance with a rite that acts as the guiding element for that action, or for that event. Basically, the idea of the rite is to guide the... I don't want to say karma, because that's not the right word, but to guide the essence of an action to its most successful outcome. For example, I guess a good example
of the Dharma, then?
Yeah, of the Dharma, exactly. I guess a good example would be preparing a ritual or a prayer before a battle. That way the battle may go in your favor. It's basically trying to... Evola puts it as the manipulation of invisible forces to try to change the outcome of one thing or another. And while in modern society this does have a very superstitious connotation to it, in the world of tradition, this was considered to be quite a real phenomenon. Whereas, the priests were just as important as the warriors. The ones who performed the rites were just as important as the one who carried out the physical act of doing. So basically, he says
you could see that even in the Trojan sagas of Homer, with the Iliad and the Odyssey, where both Troy and Greece had favor from different gods in the pantheons of Olympus, and both were trying to do their best to give sacrifices and give rituals to appease the gods and have them gain favor for their side. And it was a 10-year-long war, so obviously both were doing a fairly good job at appeasing the gods in their respective circumstances, but eventually the Greeks won out.
Yeah. That's very much the same idea. Here, I'll start off by reading the kind of the intro paragraph, and you can get a better idea of what we're talking about here. So he says, as the king by divine right was the center of the traditional state, two elements, right, R-I-T-E, and faithfulness, which is fides in Latin, connected particular components, and activities within the social order to the center, so the spiritual center, and allowed individuals to partake of the transcendent influence emanating from the sovereign, or from the king. A rite was the original cement binding together traditional organizations, whether large or small, considered in their non-naturalistic dimension. The rite was first of all the prerogative of the king, second of the aristocratic or priestly classes, and of the magistrates, whom the Greek called, there's a term here I can't read, but the Greeks called those whose responsibility it is to perform sacrifices, and and finally of the patres, or the heads of the households. Rites and sacrifices were regulated by detailed and strict traditional norms that left no room for anything arbitrary or subjective. The same goes for the law, by the way, in the last chapter. The performance of the rites and sacrifices was imperative, ius strictum. A ritual or sacrifice that was neglected or performed by an unqualified person, or performed in a way that did not conform to traditional rules, was considered a cause of misfortune for both individuals and society, since it unleashed dreadful powers both in the moral and in the material order. Conversely, in the classical world, it was said that the priest in charge of the holy fire saved the city through his ritual day after day. In the Chinese tradition, to establish the rites was the first of the three most important things in the government of an empire, since the rites were, quote-unquote, the channels by which we can apprehend the ways of heaven. In the Hindu tradition, the sacrificial sites were considered to be the seats of cosmic order itself. It is very significant that the expression rita, which is artha in Persian, appears in connection with analogous conceptions as the root of the Latin word ritus, or ritual action. In the ancient traditional way of life, both at an individual and a collective level, every action was connected with a determined ritual element that acted as its support and as the transfiguring guiding element from above. The tradition of rites and sacrifices, which was often confused with the legislative tradition, hence the notion of ius sacrum, referred both in the private and in the public dimensions to a non-human being, or to a being who had transcended the human condition. This can hardly be comprehended by our modern secular mentality that views every ritual either as outdated superstition, so kind of like how I prefaced that with, I actually didn't know he said that, or as mere ceremony to be appreciated merely for the sake of its symbolical, aesthetic, or emotional value. At this point, I wish to discuss some of the aspects and meanings of this particular form of the traditional spirit. So then he goes on to discuss the idea of the Brahman, the idea of various heroes that were able to perform their own sacrifices and rites and kind of consecrate themselves, which I believe he goes on to say in the later chapter. Just kind of, yeah, he goes on to say in a way later chapter. Okay, never mind.
We can bring it back to the a Christian-centric perspective, though, just so people who aren't as familiar with these different traditions and cultures might still get the same essence through the substance they're presented.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what would you like to say? Do you want me to go, or do you?
No, I had some. I just didn't know if you were done with the reading and summary of this chapter.
Oh no, the summary is basically done. Basically, the idea of the rite is what gives form to the essence of an action. Basically, is the idea of the chapter, and then that was substantiated by his
Helps
writing.
Give. I'd say it's also what Evola is trying to get at. To the previous two chapters, the rite is what materially justifies the ruling status of that center pole, whoever that may be in society, through the carrying out of the proper duty of these rites and rituals. And that is the thing that gives legitimacy to, their reign. And messing that up or having some omen be presented through these rites being these rites going wrong, or so forth, may be a sign for the people to reject that person as ruler or as their elites. And we can even kind of see that today in our modern societies. But even in the more Christian spirituality, you have in Evola being Italian, Catholicism was a very huge part, and still is a very huge part of their identity. The traditions and rites within the Catholic canon, the praying of the rosary, the certain prayers that you do give, the anointment of oils, that is given by priests to those who are sick or injured, and so on and so forth, and these different things. Your consecration in the church, and the just had a bit of deja vu there for a second. That was weird, but the maybe we did talk about this last episode towards the end, huh? Regardless,
I think
but
we may have, yeah.
the acceptance you get into the church through the rite that you must proclaim before you're actually accepted as Catholic in the church, and these other various traditions. And it is very much, sadly, the case that so many people do see this as symbolic and ceremonial, not necessarily substantive in any way, whereas they always were and have been, because there is that connection between the material and spiritual in the procession of these rites, and abandoning those will only lead to a slippery slope that we now see ourselves sliding down. Anything you want to say on that?
Well, essentially, yeah, it goes all the way up to the consecration of kings, and he Evola talks about later, maybe he's already talked about the idea of Charlemagne. No, he doesn't. He talks about it later. Basically, Charlemagne was this, king who kind of claimed power for himself over the authority of the church. Basically, he said, "I'm going to crown myself emperor," and so it's this idea of this regal personality going through that type of regal ceremony. That's obviously the most dramatic example of it. But the idea of a regal consecration of a king in itself is this idea of the right that needs to be maintained each time a new king came into power, because that conferred upon him a certain right, R-I-G-H-T. It conferred upon him the certain right to rule over his people, which is that, again, that divinely ordained idea of sovereignty that the king had. So, and then Cody, you're getting onto the idea of the personal prayers as well, like praying the rosary and all of that good stuff. All of it is to bring on, or to is to try to sway the direction of certain activities or events in a positive manner by invoking a more deified authority than yourself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's adhering to a behavior so that you don't fall out of favor with God, or you don't slip into sin type of deal, to keep it within that Christian-centric perspective. But there are other ways of explaining it from different traditional points of view, which Evola does get at.
Yeah, he gets at first. He says, as far as sacrifice is concerned, according to a text universally regarded as very old, which is, I like the way he says that. According to a text which is universally regarded as very old. But in any case, he says, Brahmin, which is essentially the priest caste of the Hindu society, or is one of their it's basically the caste that comes after Brahman, which is actually part of the mythology, or the not the pantheon, but the mythos, I guess, as it were. Anyways, Brahman, which in the beginning constituted the entire universe, created a higher and more perfect form of itself, from which the gods of the warriors, which are Indra, Mitra, and so on, came into existence. So, basically, Brahman performed a rite to kind of become more than the world in which it already was, and so from it came the various other deities or deified powers or what have you. Essentially, so then he says the primordial power's ability to go beyond itself, an act that is credited with the origination of entities that are the heavenly archetypes of the divine and triumphal regality, is strictly connected with the nature of an entire class of sacrifices. A similar idea is found in a cycle of other myths in which we witness a fundamental identity between heroes and gods who fight victoriously against the personifications of the forces of chaos. So you'll find that in Olympus, you'll find it in the Nordic traditions, you'll find that in the Roman tradition, which again is, I guess it's Hellenic tradition. You'll find that in the Egyptian tradition, in the Aztec tradition, in the Mayan tradition, in the Japanese tradition. In all of these traditions, you have these deified and personified versions of powers which fight against chaos. And chaos can be considered symbolically to be understood as relativity or a lack of order. So not necessarily something that is equal and opposite to order, but as something that is the absence of order, or the direct result from too many actualized potentials, if that makes sense. That's getting more into
it may not even be something that's it may not even be something that you consider conscious, but a rejection of that altogether.
Yeah.
Just a force of entropy, as you will.
Yeah, exactly. Which is kind of contradictory to the idea of centrality and polarity, if you want to talk about it symbolically, because, strictly speaking, you can consider the monad, that monistic circle with the dot in it, as that entity of reality itself, and that dot would represent, Earth here and now, but you would have to, or that dot at the center, Earth here and now, is the most relative point, or one of the most relative points of the entire universe, which is represented by that outer sphere. So it's kind of a contradictory nature in symbolism, because then you'd have to find an even smaller point in the center to see as that actual center of the world around which everything does revolve. So it's a contradiction you may find in certain symbologies depending on how it's depicted. So that's another reason why I think polar symbolism should have waited, is because there is a contradiction in the idea of a center being the most relative versus the least relative. But we can get into that, as we kind of wrap up the book, because it is mentioned later on. But anyways, he goes, according to its original meaning, the type of sacrifice to which I refer correctly responds to either a similar action that generates a god or a hero, or to its repetition, which is connected to a sacrificial tradition centered on that particular god or hero. This repetition either renews the effective power of that god, or reproduces it and develops it within the order of a given community. So basically, if an act is partaken of by a given god or a hero, that act, if it is potent enough or has a potent enough result, can then be transformed into a rite that is participated in by lesser beings to kind of reenact, re-symbolize, and re-invoke the same power that was invoked by that original act. So, for example...
And Evola throughout the chapter... Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Evola throughout most of the chapter then gives several examples of the different gods and heroes throughout different myths and traditions that do have all these acts, mainly of sacrifice, like he named earlier with Odin, and his application through sacrifice to be a person partaking in heroism and aristocracy, and what Evola said is Uranian immortality, to be the leader of the Nordic gods. But then he brings up individuals mythic characters like Osiris and Horus and so on, doing all of these other acts or the establishing of rites themselves to have this spiritual connection to the people who can replicate or reenact many of these virtues that are displayed by the gods or God himself, and having that connection to legitimize, our behavior in the material world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Let's see. Yeah, he kind of does just go into quite a lot of examples. He mentions, Osiris, like you said, Odin. The idea of sacrifice is a major theme throughout the rites. Not just the sacrifice of a living being, but the sacrifice of something. For example, Odin did sacrifice his eye for knowledge, type of idea. So, the idea of sacrifice in favor of receiving something that is more potent than that which is sacrificed is more is a common theme throughout many rites. Let's see. I guess the
Well, we can move on to the difference in the practice of these rites and how fundamental they are to different castes, or even how you can differentiate who belongs to what caste in this aspect.
Yeah. So I'm just kind of like reading over again because there's a lot here too. There's a lot here to take in. One of the most efficacious examples, he says, the unfolding of the ritual action par excellence is in its most complete form, which is the Vedic sacrifice, reveals three distinct phases. First of all, there is a ritual and a spiritual purification on the part of the person performing the sacrifice that put him in real contact with invisible forces and facilitated the possibility of his dominating them. What followed was an evocative process that produced a saturation of these energies, either within the person performing the sacrifice, within the victim, or within both, or even within a third element that varied according to the structure of the rite. And finally, there was an action that induced a crisis, for example, the slaying of the victim, and that actualized the presence of a god out of the substance of the evoked influences. And so he talks about he says, with regard to a new city, and it is the formation of that. And there's a Greek word in those civilizations of a higher. I mean, I'm not even gonna pretend. Basically, it's the formation of that rite is what I'm gonna substitute it with. That in those civilizations of a higher type was identified with the royal fortune. To consider such entities simply as personified abstractions is to adopt the perspective of profane knowledge. In ancient Egypt, the divine king presided over the rites. In ancient Egypt, the divine king presided over the rites related to the construction of new temples. He even performed, in a symbolical and ritual fashion, the first steps in the construction process. To the vulgar construction materials, he also added gold and silver, which symbolized the divine element that he bestowed, by virtue of his presence and of his right, upon the visible construction as its soul. In this regard, he acted in the spirit of an eternal deed, and in some inscriptions it is written, "The king permeated the ground that will become the abode of the gods." So, that's one thing that I don't think many people realize, is that there was not just an initiation of an individual into a cult. There was not just an initiation of an individual into society, not just an initiation of a king into his position, but there was an initiation of a city into establishment. There was a rite that was supposed to be performed that was to establish cities, and that was what that kind of closely connects to local gods or patron deities or what have you that preside in a given area. But those rites were supposed to appease that spirit or that omen and give that city a proper direction. Anything to add?
Yeah, it's on that, the appeasement and right thereof for that city, however closely it was adhered to, there would be historical accounts of, the city expanding and falling out of that tradition, like Evola stated in the beginning of the chapter. The modern perspective, and again, when it comes to him saying modern and traditional, it's only coincidental in a sense that modernity is the time we live in, and tradition is ancient. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way because there are the cycles throughout history, like the fall of Rome was their modernity, whereas the empire was them being that traditional aspect of things, and so on and so forth. But these cities growing, or these empires growing, would be adherents to these rights, and have these protections, and as those in Bertari would say, would be crushing, and justifying their expansion, and the exhibition of their skill and prowess over whatever it could be. It could even be something like Florence during the Renaissance, and the expansion of art and artistry that they did produce and share with the world. And Florence became very powerful for a long time because they did get in that modern aspect of things, but there was a root of some sort of traditional aspect of life, like with the Medicis, as we've talked about in previous episodes. Did very much get involved in the Catholic Church, did get very much in things like finance, and gave these rights their due, as they treated towards their own Catholic tradition, and their city and their bloodline flourished because of it. But then they fell out of maintaining that right and just expected these things to continue themselves, and they then fell back into normality of the common man. And you could see that on an individual level too, where this adherence to that rite and ritual is a designation of where you would be within a caste. The people who are far more active in pursuing these rites and traditions, these esoteric ideas, are the ones that generally, by just the virtue of their virtue, climb the socioeconomic ladders within their societies, even if that may be towards the darker element of things, like the borderline or outright satanic actions of those who we see in power in our modern society. That is a cause for whatever right or tradition they are following, as dark and wrong as it may be in a sense. It still gives them a certain power over society as a rule, and the common folk might not be doing that at all, and they just have this go with the flow, big Lebowski mindset of things, like I mentioned before.
Yeah, definitely. So to kind of wrap up the chapter, one of the last paragraphs begins with Olympiodorus wrote that the whole world is one great symbol, since it reflects invisible realities through sensible forms. And I wrote, I mentioned this before. I know we've brought it up. This was what we were talking about on the atheist episode, the physical world and of symbology. But I think it's important to talk about it here as well, because it does have some significance in conveying the importance of the rite to someone who understands this one basic principle, which I think maybe Evola should have opened with. But basically what I wrote is, all esoteric religious or spiritual understanding is fundamentally based around symbology. One of the conclusions at which only one with the highest understanding can arrive at from most esoteric knowledge is that physical reality is nothing but a symbol and a dramatization of the interaction between various metaphysical principles and forces, and that all experiential information is a way of transposing an awareness of these interactions to the various principles comprised in every physical manifestation. All physical bodies or manifestations themselves then should be understood as the amalgamations of the various extensionary offspring of various principles, and thus as symbols which correspond to not one but many principles. This is the subconscious worldview of one who has completed the esoteric arts, so to speak. So this idea of symbology, basically what I'm saying is that everything in the physical world is more or less a composite principle of many different principles, or of many reductible traces back to one independent principle or another. And so this idea of symbology, of the physical world being a simulation, or not a simulation, a symbol of sorry,
To some people it might be.
yeah, right.
Going back to the Matrix again.
Yeah. But this idea of physical reality being a symbol of various principles which become, transposed into various composite beings, such as humanity, or such as a tree, or such as a house, or what have you. This is what helps to understand this importance of the rite, invoking that single principle to which one thing is supposed to correspond. So it's this idea of physical reality bearing some significance in transposing that idea of the symbol into actualization, or trying to invoke that idea of that one principle in physical reality itself. So it's very deep and interconnected stuff, but it kind of bears some significance, or it kind of bears some significance to what we're saying here.
It's that Aristotelian theory of form that we mention often too, which is that the other way of thinking about the being and becoming mentality. And it's the idea that the physical objects are that becoming from that Aristotelian form that exists in some immaterial space, that perfect idealization of it, just consequentially of it existing materially. But in the way of rites and actions and things like that, it exists in this ideal form as a means of action, and it's acted out materially, but the actions themselves are immaterial only for the actualization of this higher principle, like was established earlier on with the actions of the divine before it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess the best way I can try to decode what I wrote is in saying that, in the sense that experiential knowledge is transposing an awareness from one principle to another. That is essentially what it is that, for example, if this is a very profane example, but for example, if the laundry is done, that alarm on the washing machine, or on the dryer, or whatever, transposes an awareness from the washing machine principle to the Cody principle, and so these abstract principles of washing machine and Cody now transmit information through each other in this physical form. So if physical reality is the symbol and information is the information, then the rite or the ritual is transposing that information from the physical form to the principle that is manifested beyond the physical form. So you have this mythological figure, for example, who creates a chair, and he creates it perfectly through a fashion which is then replicated by every other chair maker to try to make a chair as good. And by replicating that fashion in which the mythological figure made the chair, now their chair is that much better because they went through that whole ritual process. Whereas if they were to just make it profanely without performing that rite, then it would be less of a chair. It's that same idea.
Exactly.
But I think we've kind of gotten to the end of this chapter as well. I think this is a good place to end off. What do you say?
I agree. I hope our ramblings did make sense. I'd say we were far more refined this episode as well, and we'll only get better as the readings go on.
Yep. Yeah. I hope you have enjoyed listening into today's podcast. If you have enjoyed it, do be sure to give us a like. Leave us a comment on things we may have missed or may have not touched entirely upon and that you may have more information on, or whatever you have to add to the discussion. And if you would like to join us, you may find our Guilded link in the description down below, as well as the various social medias you can follow us on, that you can see, where we might be active or something to that degree. But thank you once again, Cody.
As always.
My name is Vincent, and we hope to see you back here next time at the Praxis Table Talks.